Vladimir Putin appears to be purging a large number of senior executives and generals. Just why is Putin cracking down on his inner circle? And is it a sign that his grip on power is diminishing? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is a pretty crazy story because recently, in the last 2 days, there's been a death of a Russian oil executive who fell out a window. Now, even those of us on this channel who aren't really party to Russian media understand that fall out a window is code for the FSB liquidated this person. But what's more interesting is, first off, the seniority of this official. He is actually the vice president of Transneft, Russia's largest state-controlled pipeline transport company. So this is not someone who produces the oil. That's Gazprom. This is someone whose company moves it. And he reportedly fell from a window in his Moscow apartment. But as we know, that this is generally considered to be code for the FSB eliminated this individual. And I think there is some, I think it's so obvious at this point that it's intentional, right? Because part of the reason Putin does these things isn't just to eliminate dissent, right? Eliminating dissent is just a small problem, a small factor. But what is more important is the signaling device. So, for example, if he was to be subtly, for example, transferred to another country and never heard from again, well, that wouldn't have the desired effect because Putin needs to tell anyone else who wants to run afoul of that, of the Putin regime in the same way that he did. He needs to signal to them, this is what your fate will be. And this makes it even more interesting. Now, this is part of a wave of suspicious deaths. Since 2020, lots of Russian businessmen, state officials, and industry leaders have died under pretty suspicious circumstances, very commonly falling out of a window. But what's more interesting is this is according to a Ukrainian military analyst and former SBU officer, said that, quote, the FSB, they can pressure a person in one way or another. It's a well-known tactic. Either you start to eliminate yourself and your family is left in peace with what they have, or they start arrests, imprisonments, and leave everyone destitute. And so this is, you could see that in 2020, right, the head of the Gazprom bank was found dead in Moscow. Just days later, a gas producer and his wife and daughter were discovered passed away at a villa in Spain. And all of these seem pretty suspicious, even though there's some arguments that it could be not the FSB, but internal rivalries within these banks and oil industries. But the most, I think, fascinating part is that, and they acknowledge this here, that Russian media is actually, well, rolling it out. But that's not the only person who's been wrapped up in Vladimir Putin's purge. And the other individual is actually a senior general. In fact, this was someone who Vladimir Putin designated a hero of Russia. This is a deputy defense minister. Now, officially, he was detained for bribery and stripped of his position and assets, as well as the assets of his wife, ex-wife, and all of his children. And that's pretty vicious. But officially, they say it's because he received a bribe. But as we know, bribery is simply just table stakes for operating within the Russian government. In fact, he was exposed in 2020 by the late Alexei Navalny for basically having a shell company who profited off construction projects by the Russian government in occupied Mariupol. So he was lining his pockets. This is very well known. This is publicly known. But nothing happened to him because, frankly, everyone was doing it until very recently. And what's more interesting is that, again, Russia's own state news agency, TASS, ran an article that said, quote, everything that is registered to Ivanov and his wife, as well as his ex-wives and 5 children, including adopted ones, and all of this property has already been seized by the government. So the Russians want the public to see, or at least they want certain people within the public to see very clearly what is happening to him, that he is being sent to effectively a Siberian prison for the rest of his life, something like 15 years, I think is what he was sentenced to. And everyone he has ever loved has also been rendered destitute. So this is not something that happens for routine kind of corruption and graft that is just absolutely endemic within Russia. Some independent individuals in the Russian media suggest that what he was actually suspected of was treason and that bribery charges were cover for a worse crime. And so this is really interesting. And what's fascinating is that the Kremlin, they say, the Kremlin denied the veracity of such suggestions. But the Kremlin's only statement was all these discussions are nothing more than speculation, which is not the same thing as that is untrue. We would have charged him with treason if he was committing treason. Because what you say instead is, well, you don't know that, which is not the same thing, right? And I think this is troubling for a couple of reasons. Now, we're going to talk in a second about the why I think both these individuals ended up in the crosshairs of the Putin regime. But before I do that, I want to mention, first off, it is the last day of our Strike Gum 4th of July sale. So do not rip yourselves off, right? If you are already a Strike Gum fan, you know you love getting the energy drink alternative, all the caffeine of an energy drink, zero sugar in a single packet. Go to strikegum.com. Use promo code LetFreedomRing and get your 20% off. Don't pay more than you have to, right? But also, guys, we are so close, more importantly, to the 6-figure mark of our fundraiser for Ukrainian units who desperately need our help fighting off these Russian fiber optic drones. We're getting them their own reconnaissance drones to track the Russian drone teams. We're improving their mobility, giving them camouflage net cover. Hundreds of you guys have stepped up from all sorts of places, literally Italy, the US, the UK, really just contributing and standing up for the Ukrainians and against Putin, including some big look at this. Anon. Okay, wait, we're gonna get rid of that actually. But we see hundreds of individuals who have stepped up in big and little amounts to help out the Ukrainians. That's a huge, huge deal. So thank all you guys that have done it. The link is in the description, and we will try to get ourselves over that 100K mark. It would be awesome, and it would mean literally life or death for these soldiers at the front. Okay. Now, here's what I want to point out. First off, this is the Russian official state news agency TASS, and you can see that they made this into a front page headline. That, listen, the vice president of Transneft, Andrei Badalov, dies in Moscow apartment in apparent self-elimination, right? And this is a simple sort of obit, but it's meant to be a signal, right? The fact is that if this was seen as something that the state didn't want to get out, they would simply not cover it through official state media outlets. Look at how many individuals, you can assume that in the federal government at any given time, dozens or even hundreds of senior bureaucrats pass away in a given year. They don't make the news. This had made the news for a simple reason, and that is because they want something within his industry or his community. Everyone should know what he did, and now everyone knows what he got for doing it. And that's actually, I think, the mystery I'm going to try to solve here. And for Ivanov, the general, I think this is the same story, right? People within the community should understand that he faced grave, dire consequences for him and his family for what he did, and that everyone should kind of know what he did. And so, because how else will you know not to do it unless that other key piece of information, right? You can't deter someone simply by randomly punishing them. You don't know what behavior you're trying to deter. And so I suspect treason in the case of Ivanov, probably working with the Ukrainian SBU or possibly even the US CIA. This is someone who, if this is the problem with, of course, a kleptocracy, is that when you use money and resources to bribe people to follow your system of government, well, someone with more money can buy you off with relative ease. You're only loyal to the almighty dollar, or in his case, ruble. Pretty bold call, though, to stay in Russia. But again, you can't really be a valuable Russian source if you leave Russia. So I think those two signals, I think his is probably more apparent, the general's, but let's try to figure out why Transneft has everyone so worked up, right? Now, Transneft is a state-controlled oil pipeline company headquartered in Moscow. It's the largest pipeline company in the world, operating basically all pipelines, 80% of oil and 30% of oil products produced in Russia. And this has been subject to sanction and corruption for a long time. Right? EU sanctions, US sanctions. Of course, in 2008, a young Alexei Navalny actually exposed Transneft for basically being a giant graft operation in which the senior executives would create their own contracting companies and double and triple bill Transneft for work they were doing. Vladimir Putin, of course, had to embarrassingly pretend that he didn't know this was happening and called for an investigation into the allegation. But since then, there's not really any news on Transneft, except when you look up Russian pipelines, you see that there has been a lot of negotiation happening around China. See, China has been interested in a Russian gas pipeline project, particularly because they're worried about the Israel-Iran war. Normally, Russian oil and gas just passes through the Strait of Hormuz, but China has their own problems, right? So sources within China say that the project has been long stalled due to disagreements over pricing and ownership, as well as China's reluctance to deepen its energy dependence on Russia. But the outbreak of war in the Middle East has led Chinese officials to reconsider the risk associated with oil and gas supplies for the region. So this is firmly a pipeline type of deal. According to one China-Russia relationship expert, quote, the volatility and unpredictability of the military situation in the Strait of Hormuz has shown the Chinese leadership that stable land-based pipeline supply has geopolitical benefits. And so what's interesting, I think, is that initially China had actually, this had been happening for a while, and China has been rejecting it, saying we don't want to be involved in Russia's Eastern Pipeline plan, even though Gazprom is losing money massively. So my theory is that his death has something to do with this, that China is suddenly now interested in this pipeline, having rejected it for a number of times. And probably my suspicion is that he was seen as the architect of why this deal couldn't get done, that he was the holdout or the obstinate negotiator, believing that he was going to try to get a better deal from the Chinese. But Vladimir Putin said, listen, the fact that Chinese are now clamoring for it, we could have had this a long time ago, but you failed to communicate it clearly to them. So I think it's a case of failure will not be tolerated. And the fact is that it's possible even the Chinese said, listen, we'll do a deal with you, but we have had so many problems with this one guy. We don't want him involved, right? And if you're Vladimir Putin or you're a senior Russian oligarch and the Chinese who stand to send you millions, possibly billions of dollars for this pipeline deal say, listen, there's this guy and he's the reason we couldn't get this deal done. That oligarch is going to go, don't worry about it. He's not going to be a problem. And so that's sort of my thesis with this. Again, I don't have any more evidence than what I just showed you, but it's the only thing I can think of that makes sense, that is high stakes enough for the Russian government to say, listen, you have to get this thing done, that is related to pipeline and pipeline deals, and the timing would have to match up, right? This whole thing sort of broke apart or went public in the days and weeks leading up to his demise. So that's sort of my thesis here. Again, you can see it doesn't take much. Negotiate too soft and lose money, out a window. Negotiate too hard and don't get deal done. Believe it or not, also out a window. But that's because, as we talked about, there's one other story that I think is salient here, and this is India, right? Remember, India and Pakistan had a shooting match a little bit over Kashmir. But one of the things that India has said is, listen, China has actually helped the Pakistani army with what they called live inputs. This includes intelligence as well as a lot of assistance in operating Chinese weapon systems. In fact, the two sides in their sort of exchange of fire, reportedly, according to the Indian military, has said, listen, the Pakistanis had integrated the Chinese into their formation, and he was getting... And as a result, China was using this conflict as a chance to test its missiles and missile defense systems. And so this, I think, is part of sort of this larger narrative, right? Here's a statement, for example, today from Mark Rutte, chairman of the EU, Secretary General of NATO. And he's saying that, listen, if China attacks Taiwan, Beijing may ask Moscow to open a second front against NATO in order to prevent a unified response. And certainly, as we talked about, Russia is going to owe China a massive favor. And frankly, Russia is now not really economically dependent on NATO or Western Europe. So for Vladimir Putin, it would be all gain and no potential loss to do so. But I want to point this out is that what we're seeing more and more is a consolidation of the world into democratic and autocratic powers. And ultimately, democratic countries in which the individuals, the citizens within them, have a right and an ability to say or contribute to who runs their country, seem to be shifting, getting stuck on one side of the aisle. But we seem to not be aware that this is happening. The only people doing this self-sorting are autocratic countries, where China, right, with its communist-dominated government under Xi Jinping, is sort of pulling in all of these satellite countries. They've had North Korea for a long time. We talked about their strong relationship with Laos yesterday. Now we're seeing that Pakistan is actually militarily extremely close to China. All of these countries are pulling themselves, these autocratic countries, drawing themselves together and are starting to say, listen, even though we have weaker economies, except for China, well, China's economy is also pretty weak. Even though we have weaker economies, we have an advantage that the West simply doesn't. And that is we have the ability to commit to things in a way Western countries simply seem to be unable to, right? Why can you imagine the U.S. government committing to a war that would inflict 1 million casualties on U.S. citizens? It's preposterous, right? In fact, if you actually adjust for population, it would be the equivalent of something like 2 to 3 million casualties. That would put it above even the Second World War. But this sort of ability to commit hard to things offsets technological advantage that you get when you're a developed, democratic, industrialized, high-tech economy. And that's sort of the danger that we're seeing more and more, is that these autocratic powers, they're not signing a formal treaty. They're not calling themselves the Axis or the Triple Entendre, as we saw in the first 2 world wars. But what we're seeing is instead a recognition by these guys that say, listen, we all have a collective interest here. China has an economy roughly the size of the United States, so China could, in theory, develop an entirely separate global trade system. Sort of the dollar for autocrats, where the China agrees to simply support these countries and not do any of the things that the U.S. tends to do, which is complain about things like human rights or treatment of minorities. Right? The U.S. tends to piss and moan about that sort of thing, whereas China simply says, listen, I don't care who's in charge of your country. We'll do business with anyone. And again, maybe you think that's good. Maybe you think, listen, this natural state of humanity is to be under the iron fist of a dictatorship and that democracy is a farce. But if you're like me, you believe that actually there's some value in human beings exhibiting a level of freedom and say in their own, in how their lives are governed. And if you believe that, then the next logical thing you have to conclude is that we have an obligation to actually confront this axis of autocracy. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you so much. Thanks to the Colonel tier members at combatvetnews.com, folks like Thomas Anderson, Dan Cochran, Jalen Gale, Deborah Murley, Deborah Oppenheimer, Paul J.W., Jeff Davies, Mike 54, Citrine Margaret, GMAC Club, and thanks to all our Lieutenant tier members. You guys are the OGs. I couldn't do it without you. Hit subscribe. See ya. Cheers.